A chilling wind swept through the city as screams echoed from the palace gates. Shadows of men and women, bound and terrified, flickered against the torchlight. Alexander's soldiers moved like a single dark wave, executing orders with ruthless precision. By dawn, 10,000 lives would vanish, leaving only silence and a ruler whose ambition knew no limits. Night fell over Thebes, but the city did not rest. Fires continued to rage, casting grotesque shadows across the ruins. Alexander did not retreat. He moved through the streets, inspecting his work as though it were a masterpiece. The surviving few huddled in corners, trembling, hoping that invisibility could save them. But Alexander's gaze was relentless. Soldiers found even the faintest signs of defiance and eradicated them with swift precision. The horror was total, leaving no room for hope or negotiation. Rumors spread quickly among the Greek city-states. Stories of Alexander's ruthlessness at Thebes traveled faster than his army ever could. Parents told their children to obey kings and generals, lest they suffer the same fate. Even distant lands trembled, recognizing the emergence of a leader who understood that fear could be as powerful as loyalty. Alexander's actions at Thebes became a blueprint for domination, a psychological weapon as devastating as his phalanx on the battlefield. Cities surrendered without a fight, armies disbanded, and entire regions bent to his will, all because they feared what might happen if they resisted. Yet Alexander's ambition was not merely strategic. There was an unyielding intensity in his character, a compulsion to test the limits of power and mortality. Witnesses would later recall the cold, almost clinical way he observed the massacre, noting the efficiency of executions and the terror in the eyes of the condemned. His mind dissected the chaos around him with terrifying clarity. What for others was madness, for Alexander was insight, a study in how fear could be engineered, measured, and wielded. By the end of that fateful day, Thebes had ceased to exist as a city of defiance. It became a monument to the consequences of opposition. The morning after the massacre, Alexander rode through the devastated streets once more. The bodies had been cleared to make way for reconstruction, but the memory of the carnage lingered like a stain upon the land. Survivors, few as they were, whispered his name in fear, recounting the faces of those who had perished. For Alexander, Thebes was a lesson, not only for his enemies, but for himself. It proved that control over life and death could solidify authority more permanently than victory in battle alone. Historians would later debate the morality of Alexander's actions, questioning whether his ambition justified such destruction. But in his own time, the logic was undeniable. Rebellion could not be tolerated, and a ruler who hesitated in enforcing absolute power would invite chaos. The massacre became a turning point, signaling to the world that Alexander's conquests were not just military campaigns. They were demonstrations of his capacity to bend the fate of cities and their people to his will. Thebes was the warning carved into the consciousness of an entire civilization. The sun had barely risen over the sprawling city of Thebes when Alexander's army surrounded it. The air was thick with smoke from the torches that lined the streets, and the distant wails of the terrified citizens echoed like a grim chorus. The city had resisted, stubborn and proud, believing its walls and its men could repel even the most relentless invader. But Alexander, young yet ruthless, had no intention of allowing defiance. Every detail had been meticulously planned. No one would escape. No mercy would be shown. The city would be reduced to ashes, its people erased, and its message carved into history. Alexander had already tasted victory countless times, but Thebes was different. It was not just another conquest, it was a statement, a warning to any city that dared challenge him. His discipline of his army was unmatched, the loyalty of his generals unquestionable, and his strategy cunning beyond what most could comprehend. Yet even among his closest companions, whispers of fear circulated. He was capable of acts that blurred the line between genius and insanity. As the gates were breached, the streets erupted into chaos. Men ran with swords drawn, trying to defend their homes, but they were swiftly cut down. Alexander walked among the ruins with a calculated calm, his gaze piercing the panic-stricken crowd. Soldiers carried out the mass executions with precision, the numbers rising so rapidly that even seasoned veterans were stunned. No distinction was made between soldier and civilian, no plea for mercy could sway his hand. Mothers clutched their children, priests shouted prayers, and elders cried out for salvation, but all fell silent under the shadow of Alexander's wrath. The executions were carried out methodically. Streets that once bustled with life were lined with the bodies of men, women, and children, the ground slick with blood. The air was heavy with smoke and the metallic scent of iron. Alexander observed from a high vantage point, a godlike figure overseeing the mortality of thousands. His mind was a furnace of ambition, each act of brutality a spark fueling his vision of unchallenged power. Some historians would later argue that it was strategic, a lesson for the Greek city-states that rebellion would meet absolute destruction. Yet even in those cold calculations, there was an unmistakable element of darkness, a fascination with absolute control. By mid-afternoon, 10,000 souls had been extinguished. The cries of the dying had faded, leaving a city that was simultaneously silent and horrifyingly alive in its devastation. The surviving structures were scarred with fire and sword, walls splintered, and doors splashed with crimson. Alexander's men moved through the city systematically, ensuring no act of defiance remained. Resistance was stamped out as efficiently as the flames that devoured the rooftops. Each step he took was a calculated message. No one could challenge him without consequence. Despite the horror around him, Alexander remained unshaken. To his soldiers, he was a masterful leader. To his enemies, an unstoppable force. Behind the calculated eyes, however, lay a deeper, more unsettling fascination with absolute dominance. Some whispered among themselves that the young king took a certain grim satisfaction in witnessing the extent of human vulnerability under his command. Every city he conquered, every army he defeated, seemed to deepen his understanding of fear and obedience. The massacre at Thebes was not merely a punishment, it was a crucible of his own making, an experiment in power and terror. In the weeks that followed, Alexander's reputation transformed into something both legendary and terrifying. He was no longer simply a young king or a brilliant strategist. He was a figure who embodied absolute authority, capable of erasing entire populations without hesitation. Thebes had become a cautionary tale, whispered in every corner of Greece and beyond. Survivors who had fled to distant towns carried with them the memory of that day, ensuring that Alexander's name would be spoken with both reverence and fear. Despite the horror, life gradually returned to the city's ruins. Alexander permitted reconstruction, but the shadow of the massacre lingered. Streets were rebuilt, homes restored, but the memory of the slaughtered thousands was immortalized in collective consciousness. Soldiers recounted the meticulous execution of orders, the relentless precision with which the killings had been carried out, and the unflinching calm of their leader. Every act of brutality had been a demonstration of discipline, a showcase of the terrifying synergy between a determined ruler and his obedient army. Alexander himself moved on swiftly, driven by unending ambition. Thebes had served its purpose, a message to all who dared resist, a testament to the consequences of opposition. His conquests continued, but the lessons of Thebes, fear, obedience, and absolute authority, remained etched in his mind. Generals, allies, and adversaries alike understood that Alexander's vision of empire was built not only on victories in battle, but also on the unshakable enforcement of power through terror. Years later, historians would look back at the massacre and struggle to comprehend its scale. 10,000 lives lost in a single day, a city devastated, and an empire warned into submission. Alexander's darkest day became one of the most infamous events in history, a blend of strategy and horror that defined his reign. And yet, behind the calculated execution, there remained the haunting presence of a man driven by a vision so immense that it consumed morality, compassion, and the very lives of those who stood in his path. The echo of Thebes resounded far beyond its walls. It was a story of ambition, ruthlessness, and the terrifying efficiency of a ruler who would stop at nothing. Alexander the Great had proven that the path to power was lined with blood, and that in his pursuit of greatness, he could and would execute 10,000 souls in a single, unforgettable day.